So hey guys, good question. A lot of people debate how do you take the Old Testament and the law. So I think first thing that you've got to keep separate are that there are different covenants, different relationships that God enters into. You have kind of how God relates to Adam at the beginning. There's some rules there. Before the fall, he's not to eat from the tree. After the fall, there's some rules set up for man. After the flood, you can read those passages that are given to Noah right after he gets out of the ark about capital punishment being set up. We're explicitly told at that point in time we can eat meat. There's some debate whether you could eat meat before that, but we're explicitly told then that you can eat meat. So there's things. So those things given to Adam and Noah, they represent all mankind, and those are rules that are still applicable to all mankind. Then you get to God's covenant with Abraham. That happens more than one spot. Genesis 12, Genesis 18, I think it's repeated again. Genesis maybe 25, you could look those up. Those were specific promises given to Abraham and his seed unconditionally. Galatians makes it clear that Jesus, as Abraham's seed, is the ultimate recipient of those promises. And they are ultimately fulfilled in Jesus. And I think Ephesians makes it clear that we as Christians, even though we're Gentiles, we're in Jesus, and because Jesus is the recipient of those as standing in for national Israel, we have been brought near to those promises. Does that mean that America is Israel? No, but it means that Jesus is going to set up his kingdom from Israel, and we are part of his body. So then I'm going to guess y'all weren't really talking about those. You're probably more discussing about the Mosaic Law. The Mosaic Law is a contract between God and the Israelites. And it's clear that that contract's not even in place anymore. And so that contract is null and void, and Gentiles were never part of that contract. So in one sense, it's true that the law is not incumbent upon Gentiles. We don't have to obey anything in the Mosaic Law because it's in the Mosaic Law. Now, what's also true is that a lot of the Mosaic Law, all of the Ten Commandments, except for one, is repeated in the New Testament. And the one that's not repeated verbatim, to keep the Sabbath day holy, is we're still told to not forsake the assembling of the church. We're still told to fellowship with one another. And so while we may not have to keep the Sabbath day holy like the Jews did, we still are supposed to take a Sabbath day rest. We're still supposed to assemble with everyone. There's also parts of the Mosaic Law that are repeated. The proscription against homosexuality, Paul repeats. So there is a lot that's repeated that we should keep. There are some things that were specifically told are now done away. Peter's there and he gets the vision, the sheet comes down. The main goal of that is that Gentiles are now included. The Gentiles can become believers. That's the main point, but part of the point is the food laws are no longer in place. So when we look at the Mosaic Law, Paul tells us in Galatians that the law is there as a school teacher. It's there it's for more than one reason, but one of the primary reasons is to teach us that we're sinners, that we can't keep the law, and that we, once we realize we can't keep the law, it has us come to God and beg for mercy. So when we look at the Mosaic Law, other than that overarching thing of teaching us that we're sinners, It also has three main roles. One is that it reflects God's moral nature. So we see things in the Mosaic Law about not stealing, not murdering, not lying, and we would say those are eternal qualities of God's moral nature. We see some things that just kept the Jews a separate people. We would call those ceremonial laws, like not mixing threads in a fabric. You couldn't have a shirt that had both cotton and linen mixed. You need to be either all cotton or all linen. Well, does that reflect God's moral nature, or is that more of a symbol to the Jews that they're not to be mixed? They're supposed to stay pure. So there were ceremonial parts of the law, and then there were also civic parts of the law that basically told how their government ran, gave penalties for breaking the rules, told the Levites how they're going to collect taxes, how the Levites would get land, all of that stuff. And then sometimes there's overlap. Maybe there's a rule that meets more than one of those things. There's, you can read a section about God, Leviticus 22, and it talks about, man shall not lie with man, and then it also gives the penalty for that. So that's somewhat civic and it's somewhat moral. How do we tell what out of the Mosaic Law reflects God's eternal moral nature? Because those things would still be incumbent on us. And how do we tell what would be ceremonial or civic that we don't have to continue to keep? Well, one good way is if it's repeated in the New Testament, especially after Christ's death, then that would be a good indication that we're still supposed to keep that. So Paul, you can look at his list of sins that we're supposed to stay away from, and you're going to see homosexuality still in there. You're going to see that stealing is still wrong. You're going to see lying is still wrong. Sometimes we just look at it and we reflect on the nature of the thing. We think, is this a moral thing? So sometimes it's just our reason. The proscription against tattoos is also on a line about not cutting your beard and some other things. And it looks like that's more ceremonial because it says, don't do this like the other nations when they grieve for their dead. So that doesn't appear to be a sin issue, at least in my book. I would say it's a wisdom issue. I don't know that it's wise to get tattoos, but it wouldn't be one of those a sin issue, because nowhere in the New Testament is there a rule against getting a tattoo. So I hope that helps. So you can't just throw it all out. A lot of it's repeated, and if it's repeated in the New Testament, that's a good indication, like I said before, that it still applies to us today. If it's not repeated, then we kind of got to look at how's it functioning in the Mosaic Law? How does it? Is it civic? Is it ceremonial? Does it seem like this might be a eternal moral thing of God, or does it seem like it's for the Jews at that time? And if it is, like don't eat shellfish, then that's not incumbent on us today. We can eat shrimp. We can eat fish without scales. We can eat pork. Those things are part of the ceremonial part of the law that are no longer in place. The sacrifices also part of the ceremonial or civic law, and since Jesus' one-time sacrifice paid our sins, we don't offer sacrifices anymore. That part of the law is done away with. Jeremiah 31:31, if you read that, says, I'm going to make a new covenant with my people, and I'm going to write the law in their hearts. So there is some truth to this idea that when we love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, when we love our neighbor as ourselves, that encapsulates the law. Paul says if we do that, we're going to keep the law. Well, none of us do that perfectly, and sometimes we get confused. So Paul also still gives us some specifics about how we live our life. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's just love people, or I wouldn't say it's just the law, we got to follow it all. It's we got to use our noggins a little bit and read through and figure out what to keep, and then what we say is part of the ceremonial law. Hope that helps. If you got any questions, feel free to text back, and I can try to address it. Thanks.